Well, hello everybody, Greg Eisenhoff. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is law enforcement and the history a little bit with law enforcement, where it came from and where it's going today. And when we start talking about, well, what does law enforcement actually do? We start looking at the parts of, well, law enforcement, we provide services, we enforce the laws, we prevent crime, and we bring peace to the communities. And some of you may snicker right now and go, yeah, bring peace, right? All you do is police brutality. Not necessarily. When you look at the facts of how many police officers there are, how many arrests there are, and how many things are actually occurring in the United States, law enforcement, for the most part, has done a really good job. Now, has there been problems in the past? Absolutely. You can't deny it. Has there been corrupt police officers? Yes, there has. Or yes, there have. But the question is this: what is being done to correct that? And we start looking at eras throughout this presentation that I'm going to do, you're going to see how there's been a lot of reforms to law enforcement. And like every different era has little tweaks in what we have to do to manipulate things to be able to make law enforcement work efficiently. So when we start talking about where in the heck did law enforcement even come from? I mean, how did we even develop police agencies here in the United States? And I want you to take yourselves back to the Roman Empire and how the Roman Empire would use their soldiers, okay, and even 18th century Europe, okay, but specifically the Roman Empire, everybody's familiar with that. They would actually have their soldiers, okay, take care of the jails, take care of actually a lot of the crime that was going on there. And the soldiers basically were the military as well as the police, and the kings would use them, okay, and they'd also have citizens do night watch patrols throughout their kingdom and stuff as well. But when it came down to it, when you look at the Roman Empire, they were the ones that arrested people. They were the ones that put them in the prisons and took care of all the parts of basically the law enforcement side of things during that time. But now we're like, okay, well, where did things start changing a little bit? Where did the order start happening? Because there wasn't really order per se, okay, back in the beginning of time. But we have to look back at like Alfred the Great back in 10th century England. He creates this thing that we call the Frank Pledge system. And under Frank Pledge system is where we kind of get history of law enforcement today. And I want to break it down to you. So basically under the Frank Pledge system, and you might want to write this down because this is on the test. The Frank Pledge system basically has 10 households. If you have 10 households, that 10 households would become a tithe or a tithing. All right? Now, you have 10 tithings, right? So 10 tithings together equals what? 100, right? Which was known as a parish. So you had 10 tithing, right? 10th, okay? Then you had 10 tithings, which is 100, which was known as a parish. Then, when you had several parishes, you had a thing, what they call a shire, S-H-I-R-E. Now, there was a supervisor over the shire, and that supervisor was called the reeve. So, the supervisor who oversaw all the shire was the shire reeve. Hence, we get the term sheriff. So, wait a second. You're saying, oh, wait, yeah, a county has several different townships, which we could call parish, right? Several different parishes, okay? And the sheriff is the one that oversees them. So, shire reeve, sheriff, all right? So, you might want to know that. That's on the test. I can guarantee you on that. So, we're looking at, okay, so back in the day, where do we actually get the formalization of law enforcement today? So let's talk a little bit about that. When we look at England or London and we look at how it was controlled and when did people start getting paid? Well, London started paying the first magistrates that they had, and they call them the Bow Street Runners. And that was developed under Henry Fielding. Now, I know your textbook says John Fielding, but we have to understand it was actually developed with Henry Fielding, and John Fielding is actually Henry's half-brother who also worked with him. So if you see Henry and John Fielding together, that's why you're going to see that, okay, everybody? So on the test questions and stuff like that, the main name that you want to remember of who ran those Bow Street Runners, who started it, created that stuff, was Henry Fielding, okay? But then we start looking at, all right, so when they started having these, magistrates starting to do these patrols, which we call the Bow Street Runners, there had to be formalization behind that. Now, the formalization that occurred behind all of that was, I like to call him the godfather of law enforcement. because this dude was the godfather of law enforcement. His name, Sir Robert Peel. Anybody who works in law enforcement knows Sir Robert Peel, because Sir Robert Peel actually developed during that time, and I believe it was in 1829, he developed the first Metropolitan Police Act. So the Metropolitan Police Act that he created, Sir Robert Peel, basically formalized and professionalized law enforcement. He had 9 principles of success for any law enforcement agency to be successful. Those 9 principles, I kid you not, we talk about that in the police process class, which you could take as well. But we get more in depth with the 9 principles of it. But I will say this. The 9 principles, he does say a couple things. One, that law enforcement should be uniformed due to the fact that they need that authority presence, that police presence. Why? To deter crime. But he also gets into the part that says it takes the community and law enforcement working together to be successful. And we see that today. And law enforcement and the community must come together, must come together more so that they can be unified and work better together. So, okay, let's look. All right, so this is, you're talking about London here, right? Well, let's bring it to the United States now. When did we start getting law enforcement here in the United States? Well, it depends if we're looking at federal or if we're looking at metropolitan, okay, when we're looking at cities. So when we start breaking that piece down, okay, we have to understand that the United States, okay, came up with a decentralized model for our law enforcement, which I think is extremely wise. So we're a federalist country, which means that the powers are divided, right? We have the federal government and we have the states. Okay, and under Article 6 of the United States Constitution, we find a thing that's called the Supremacy Clause, which means that the federal government overrides the what? The states. Okay, it has like the final say, the federal government does. It's a strong central power, yes, but we're still federalists, so we have shared powers between the federal government and the states. Okay, so we know what federalism is. Decentralized model means this. There's not one law enforcement agency for the whole United States. So you can't say, oh, well, the whole United States is protected by the FBI. That's not true. Because there's there's thousands of police agencies, okay, all over the United States. So it's a decentralized model. It's not centralized. Decentralized means there's several different ones. Centralized means there's one, if that makes sense. So the United States came up with a decentralized model. So it has a federal government law enforcement agencies, and then it has the state. We're going to talk about the different states and stuff like that later on of what the states have for their law enforcement as well. So you have the federal government as well as the states. I'll stop talking about that and move forward. Okay. So what happened was we had tons of immigrants coming into the United States all at once. And when we had all those immigrants coming into the United States at once, where did they go? To New York. New York was overpopulated, heavily populated. There wasn't enough housing. There wasn't enough jobs. What started happening? Organized crime. All right, so all the organized crime started occurring at this point, and the mayor's like, no, this isn't good. We're going to have to come up with some kind of law enforcement agency, a real professional metropolitan police agency, and that is where NYPD was developed. And it started out, I think, with 16 officers. And now look at it today. Thousands of officers for NYPD. And several different divisions and bureaus that fall under NYPD. It's grown immensely since that time. But what they had to do is they had to gain order in New York City for all the issues that it had going on. Now, you'll read in other textbooks that Boston actually adopts this watch system, okay? And it was basically credited for being one of the first police agencies, but it wasn't an official professional police agency like NYPD, okay, is. So when you look at, what was the actual first metropolitan professional police agency? It's actually NYPD. So just remember that one, okay? Now we're going to talk about the 4 different eras that occurred in law enforcement. So in the beginning, now we start having these police metropolitan agencies. We also have federal agencies, developed here in the United States. But what happens during this time is crucial. So as we start looking at periods, okay, the political era basically happened between 1840 and 1930. And then you got the Reform era, which occurred between 1930s up to the 1980s. Now, you might look in some textbooks, it may be a year or two difference, but who cares? Somewhere during that time. Then we move from the Reform era to the Community era. Now, the Community era goes from about 1980 to right in 2001, because something happens in 2001, and we start talking about 9/11. So September 11th, 2001, what happens here? We all should know what happened there. That's when the terrorists attacked New York City with the planes, as well as they had one go hit the Pentagon. And there was basically several different airplanes that were actually taken over by terrorists, and we all know the effects that 9/11 had here in the United States. But that changed to what our textbook would say the Homeland Security era, but also other textbooks will call that the New Era. Okay, so whether you call it New Era, Homeland Security era, Jimmy Crack Corn, I don't care. It's one of those two eras. Pick your choice. But those are the time frames. So let's talk a little bit about what that looked like. So basically, in the political era, there was a lot of corruption going on. I mean, we look at from 1840 to 1930, basically what happened is there was bribery and corruption from the political leaders. Okay, so you'd have a mayor, you'd have senators, you'd have people basically saying, okay, so do you want a job? Okay, so I'll tell you what, I'll make you chief of police here. Give me $1,000 and I'll make you that title. And at that point, I need you to work with me and do what I basically want being done. So then basically they start bribing the law enforcement with bribes to make them, oh yeah, I'll do this for you. I'll take care of this for you, boss. And law enforcement was so poorly paid that those bribes, okay, kept that corruption going. Because I want you to think about something. You give somebody great power, that basically, when you give somebody the power to arrest somebody and take away their rights, but you don't pay them hardly anything, and they got to deal with all the negativity that's going on, and you barely give them any money. Well, let me ask you something. So, hey, somebody says, if you overlook my establishment during Prohibition that's selling alcohol, I'll give you all the free alcohol you want, and I'll pay you $1,000 a month. That would probably be pretty appealing to many officers, in which they'd be like, okay, we can make that happen. I'll overlook you, you give me my money, give me my free alcohol, and life's good on your end and my end. So what we started seeing is a lot of that stuff occurring during that time. You had a person called, you'll hear the term Boss Tweed. And basically Tweed, he basically was a political leader that handled Tammany Hall, okay, Tammany Hall. And basically what he did is a ton of fraudulent stuff. And then would pay off officers, okay, and it was a hot mess, okay, and he made his way right up in the political ranks, okay. So when we start looking at what was occurring there, something had to be done to stop all this corruption in the political arena as well as the law enforcement arena, because the political arena kind of controlled all law enforcement. So law enforcement would be like, what do you want me to do, boss? Well, I want you to do this. Go by the polls and tell people to vote for me. Or, hey, take these people out to the bar, get them liquored up on voting day, and then drive them over to the polls and make sure they vote for me. Okay, so, we start seeing corruption occur, all right? And it was a hot mess. And through that hot mess, it had to be changed. So, what happened? So Hoover does this thing. He says, hey, I want the Wickersham Commission developed. So Wickersham Commission, can't say it right, can't speak. Basically what they start doing is a study. And they start finding out through their study, okay, that it was during Prohibition. They're like, well, what do we do, with all the crime that's going on? And they start finding that there's tons of corruption. Okay, there's coercion going on with law enforcement. There's cover-up going on. It's messy. There's tons of just corruption going on every end from that political era, all the way from the top, officials, all the way, down to the regular working officers. So there had to be a cleanup. So what we get into at this point is what we call the Reform era. So in 1930 and 1980, we start looking at how do we make law enforcement more professional? What can we actually do? So at this point, you start seeing people come in, 1929 with that Wickersham Commission, or the committee, focused on two areas, okay, police brutality and corruption of the influence of politics. They looked at those two specific areas and came up with a bunch of findings to find that there was so much corruption that now we had to reform it. So now we're in this reform era. So what does that call for? Well, it called for different educational standards for law enforcement. Okay, well, what training now do law enforcement have to go to? Let's make this professional. So at this point, officers would start being trained, okay? There was more at that point, the centralized authority of, well, let's get some standards together of what law enforcement should be doing for training so that, we can professionalize it all across the United States. They started putting call boxes, radios, and then motorized patrols started coming. So when we start looking, at first, they didn't have cars, so they walked on foot. So they walked over to what we call these call boxes. They'd pick up the phone, and they'd say, hey, I made it to this location. Okay, I'm walking back to the other location. Should take me about 25 minutes. Bye. Click. They'd hang up the phone. They'd walk the beat back. Now, if they don't call back in 20 minutes, maybe they got into something. Maybe something bad's going on there. At that point, they could send somebody else over there to see where Officer John is, right? So those call boxes, well, technology enhances. Now we have police radios, right? We start getting motorized vehicles, okay? So at that point, now we start driving around in police cars. And we're driving around police cars using our radios. But we find during this reform era that, yeah, we're professionalizing the career more. But now we're in these vehicles driving around, and what's occurring? Well, we're not reaching out to the community anymore. We're not on foot. We're not talking one-on-one, okay? We also find out during this reform era, there's a person, I want you to know this name, O.W. Wilson. O.W. Wilson, okay, went to Wichita, Kansas, became the police chief over there, and said this corruption needs to be done. Fires 20% of the police force. 20%! His mission statement, take note, write it down. His mission statement was called the Square Deal. So the Department of Mission was like, this is the square deal. You're corrupt, you're gone. You use any excessive force, you're gone. Okay? Totally cleaned house. Okay, there was some other people, right? So when we look at Roosevelt being ahead of NYPD, started going in doing night checks and go in and catch officers doing something they shouldn't be doing, gone, right? I mean, we have some great people who came in there during that reform era and totally cleaned house and really professionalized the different agencies to make them a lot better, to get that corruption out. So we didn't have the issues that we were having in the political era. So we're in this reform era. Technology is going, like I said. Now we find ourselves sitting in police cars driving around neighborhoods, just responding to crime or driving, being visual deterrents. But we're not out in the community anymore. And guess what? That led to some problems, right? I mean, community's like, well, hold on a second. You're out there, but we really don't, we're not trusting you because we don't really know you. So at that point, the community era occurred. And during the community era, what we see at that point is we see law enforcement starting developing stuff, getting back out on foot patrols, thinking about police concepts of what can we do that makes this a lot better. How do we get this relationship built back up between the citizens of the city as well as the law enforcement ourselves? How do we build this? So you start seeing community police officers being developed, right? The community police division or neighborhood services. And they start going into the neighborhoods, creating neighborhood watch programs. You start seeing programs like DARE, right? Drug Abuse Resistance Education, being brought into the schools by police officers. So you start seeing police officers going into the schools more. You start seeing school resource officers. You start seeing this whole new thing where law enforcement now is engaging the community and working one-on-one with the community into deterring and preventing crime. Hence, one of Sir Robert Peel's success, or one of his elements that he talked about out of the 9, that you must need the community and law enforcement working together to successfully keep peace within any kind of community. And that's what we see during this era of the community era. We start seeing law enforcement go more with the community. Now, September 11th, 2001 changed everything, okay? At this point, yeah, we're going back and forth, but now we find ourselves, we just got put under attack. How do we stop this from ever happening again? Well, we found out that there was a separation between the federal government and the local governments, right? So you have the federal agencies right here gaining information that's coming from out of the country, right? So regular law enforcement, like Grand Rapids Police Department, do they know that there's a terrorist person living in their city? No, they don't, because there was no communication here. Okay, there wasn't good communication between the FBI, the CIA, right? So we needed to basically get something together. So what we started developing was fusion centers, intelligent analysts, okay? And they started building data to come together so that we could start getting information together so that we could start pumping that information to any law enforcement agencies that should be aware of it to be able to prevent this crime or to detain somebody or whatever it might be. But we needed to figure out how do we work together. So now we start finding intelligent-led policing. Okay, so the intelligence, by putting these analysts together and getting the data and having the federal government work with the local law enforcement, now we have this proactive approach for indicators so that we can prevent any kind of terrorist acts occurring here in the United States. So this is all driven by 9/11 actually happening. So now we have more of a collaboration between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Now, question. The 9/11, what you'll find this called is the Homeland Security era, but you'll also see another text that's called the New Era. Okay, so New Era or Homeland Security era, don't really care again what you call them, okay, but they're the same thing. All right, New Era, Homeland Security era, same thing. It happened after 9/11, but we find ourselves in an interesting place now. So if you look at all the different eras, what era are we in now? Is law enforcement starting to change ways because of mistrust within the community again? I would say yes. So what is this era going to be called? I have no idea. Somebody smart's probably going to come up with an era now. They're going to do research on it, and they're going to start seeing that, okay, there's a centralized model now that's being put into place that if there are any officers that are fired because of any police misconduct, they're now put on a list so that if they were a police officer here in Grand Rapids and they get fired, right, they get put on the list now. So if they go down to New Orleans, in some small town, down in New Orleans, maybe they apply down there. Well, guess what? Now New Orleans will see. Or maybe they apply for some small city down in Alabama. And I'm saying that because I want it to be a long distance away, right? So they apply for a small city down in Alabama. Well, Alabama now can run their name and see, oh, wait a second. No, you were fired for police brutality. We're not hiring you. Right? So there needs to be a new way of recording officers that get fired for police misconduct to tighten up the realm of what's going on. There's also a need for more body cams on officers, right? Because it holds them accountable. Okay? And when you're giving somebody so much power to take away your rights, as well as to take your life if they need to, you know, that stuff, with all the technology we have today, that stuff should be supplied to every officer in the United States. Why? Because it holds everybody accountable to what they're doing, especially when you're given that much power that you have. So, you know, what era are we coming up with next? I don't know, but it'll be interesting. So let's talk about the different levels of law enforcement. So we have local law enforcement, right? Local law enforcement would be like your cities. When you look at Kent County Sheriff's Department around here, so your county deputies, right, the sheriffs. You look at your regular police officers dealing with like Grand Rapids PD, Lowell PD. Okay, those are your local law enforcement agencies, right? Your metropolitan cities as well as your county. Then you also look that you have the state police, okay? The state police is ran by the state, obviously, but the state police is a little bit different because there are some states like Georgia, okay, that have what we call a centralized model. Take that back. They have a decentralized model. Michigan State Police would be a centralized model. And I say that because the state police for the state of Michigan, what do? Well, the state police can investigate crimes as well as work the freeways. But when you look at Georgia's a little bit different. Georgia has the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and then they have their highway patrol. Well, that's broken up in two different ones. So Georgia is a decentralized model. Why? Because they have one that investigates and one that works the freeways or the highways. Michigan State Police, they work the highways and they work investigations, which makes them what? Centralized model. Georgia, decentralized. Why? Because one does investigations, one does the highway patrol. Do you understand the difference? I hope you do. So you look at that. So you're like, okay, cool. So we have levels of law enforcement. We have the metro police, we have the county, and the county goes obviously over the counties, okay? And then we have the state police that goes over the whole state. So then we also have levels of law enforcement that deal with the federal government. So we have the FBI, the DEA, BATF, we have HSI, Homeland Security. We have all these other agencies with the federal government, okay? Now, what do? Well, they investigate federal law, okay, where the state police investigates state law, okay? Now, what happens if somebody violates a city ordinance? Okay, well, that's up to what? The local police agencies, right? So basically, if Kentwood has a drug paraphernalia ordinance that says that you can't be in possession of drug paraphernalia, well, the state doesn't have that, okay? So let me ask you something. So if somebody is in Grand Rapids, and let's just say Grand Rapids doesn't have drug paraphernalia as one of their ordinances, so does that mean that I can possess drug paraphernalia? When I say paraphernalia, like say I got a glass tube with some Charboy and some crack cocaine, okay? Well, the three together, yeah, guess what? You're smoking crack, okay? So the tubing, the glass tube and the Charboy, that would be paraphernalia to smoke the drug, right? So at that point, if it happened in Grand Rapids, let's just say Grand Rapids didn't have that ordinance, you couldn't arrest them in Grand Rapids for the paraphernalia. However, in the city of Kentwood, guess what? It has that charge. Now you can arrest them for the drug paraphernalia if they were in Kentwood, right? So Kentwood police may be able to arrest somebody over there. If the county's in Kentwood, could they arrest them under that charge for the city ordinance? Sure. Why? Because they have, as long as they have that authority to be able to arrest them over in that area, which the county, Kentwood resides or is placed in Kent County, county officer could actually write them for that city ordinance, right? And the state police has that full authority as well over the whole state. So depending on what city they're in, as long as they have that power, they can arrest in that city, right? So what happens if a Kentwood officer wants to go over to Grand Rapids? Well, we have what we call mutual aid agreements between agencies. And that mutual aid means that you can go from city to city as long as you have that mutual aid agreement and assist in making any arrests that you need to make in different cities and help each other out or back each other up and make arrests if needed. So there's a lot of different elements that fall in with the different agencies from the state, county to local, metropolitan agencies. But then there's the federal agencies as well, and they enforce the federal law. So you may have, let's say, a bank robbery that occurs in the city of Wyoming. And at that point, there's 4 different bank robberies that occurred in the city of Wyoming. And Wyoming's like, we're done with all these bank robberies. So at that point, the feds, FBI, get involved and be like, hey, we'll take those bank robberies because that's a federal crime. So instead of keeping it at the state level, they may take it at the federal level, and they may get harsher penalties and fines. Well, they will get a harsher penalty under the federal government than they would the state government. So basically, when you look at the difference of law enforcement, there's a lot of different bureaus through the federal government as well as the state government. As far as it goes with levels of law enforcement, and we start talking about, so we have law enforcement with the federal government, right, like FBI, DEA, Secret Service, but then we go down to the state government, and we look at all law enforcement from state, county to local, metropolitans, but then we also have security, right? So if you ever, I mean, when you jump through the PowerPoint slides, you're going to find that we take private security way back to even President Lincoln. And security is not sworn personnel, okay? They're not sworn. It's a whole different way of operating things, okay? But when we take it back, Pinkerton Detective Agency actually tried to protect Abraham Lincoln through the time of what everything was going, okay? So Pinkerton Security or Detective Agency actually did protection as if they were the Secret Service for Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, that didn't work out too well for Pinkerton Detective Agency, right? Because he was assassinated. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865 of April. But if we look at Pinkerton Security, I mean, there was a Homestead steel strike in 1892 that at that point, Pinkerton went in there and it was a hot mess, and a lot of them were killed trying to separate that stuff. And we start talking about private security agencies working now in several different areas. Private security doesn't have the authority that law enforcement has. All right? They don't abide by the same Constitution of the United States of search warrants, okay? Your Fourth Amendment. They don't have that going on as a private security. Now, are there laws regulating what they can and cannot do? Absolutely. But are they held to the same standards of law enforcement, and are they given as much power as law enforcement? The answer is no, they're not given as much power that law enforcement has. All right, the standards are a lot less also for security rather than law enforcement. So we see a formalization. In Michigan, we have a thing called MCOLS, Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards. And those standards basically hone in on how law enforcement officers are to be trained, what kind of training they need to go through to get certified in the state of Michigan, and so forth. And we have that with all different agencies. Becoming a police officer, there's a slide in there. And there's a police officer from Detroit who is still in field training. And this is stupid. And what you're going to see on the PowerPoint is you're going to see a picture of him and what he posted on social media. And I believe it said something to the part of another night to wrangle up these zoo animals or something like that. But it's this officer, and he's sitting there, you know, nice haircut, and like, and he takes a picture of himself, posts that. I'm going to tell you what, when you become a police officer, one, have the right heart. Have the right heart. Have the right heart that you're getting in it to be a peacemaker. Have the right heart that you're a servant. If you get into law enforcement and you become a police officer, I'm going to tell you right now, when I drove my police car, do you know what I did? I smiled at people. I waved at people. I saw kids. I'd wave at them in the cars. Don't be the officer that sits in your car with your sunglasses on, looking straight ahead at the stoplight, looking at somebody, they wave at you, and you look back, and you're like, oh, hey. Do you wonder why people hate you? I always had a mentality, I was like, I'm not going to be hated, I'm going to be loved by the people, but they'll also know that when you mess up, you'll go to jail. Officer Eisenhoff knows what he's doing, and he's a just man. He does things the right way. And everybody on the street in my city knew Officer Eisenhoff, that officer's straight. You want to talk with him, you want to deal with him, you deal with him, because he's going to do what's right. I'm going to tell you right now, if you get into law enforcement, do what's right. Make good choices so that when you lay down at night, you can lay down with a clear conscience knowing that you did the right thing no matter whatever the circumstances were. And your decisions were solid based upon the totality of circumstances involving it. So let's talk. What does it take to become a police officer? So when you're on that slide and you see that picture, you're like, oh, wait, that's offensive. Why do you put it up there? Because I want to tell you, don't be that person. Okay? When you become a police officer, do what's right. Make sure your heart's in the right spot before you become a police officer. Treat people with respect. And treat everybody fairly the same. If they violate the law, they violate the law. Treat them just as you would with everybody else. And make sure you use necessary force to do so. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself jammed up in the cases that we're going to talk about here in a minute. When we start talking about what are the steps, okay? First, there's educational requirements, okay? You have to be certifiable, which means you have to go through a police academy. Okay, after you get through a police academy, now there's a couple different ways that you can do this, because Grand Rapids PD right now, you might be seeing that they're actually recruiting, and they'll send you through a police academy. So let's take it from the basic steps, basically what occurs. All right, so you graduate high school, you can become a police officer in the state of Michigan. Then what happens is this, there's an application process. You fill out the application, get it all good, send it in. At that point, you also have to take a civil service exam. If you pass the civil service exam, at that point, they'll look at how high you scored on the civil service exam, all right? And they'll also look at that point, your application. And if they like what they see at that point, they'll bring you in for a background check. Now, the background checks are crazy because you literally fill out a pamphlet like about 2.5 inches thick, telling everything about your whole entire life. You write down references. You write down a bio. You write down basically your financial statements, and they do a credit report on you to make sure that you're financially accountable and responsible. I did several backgrounds for the city of Kentwood. I'm going to tell you, when I did those backgrounds, I went extensively into those backgrounds. So you list down like your 10 references. Well, guess what? I go to your 10 references. Hey, who else does he hang out with? Oh, well, he hangs out with so-and-so and so-and-so. Oh, I don't see those as references. I'm following up with them. Shoot. We'd hire people who are 30-some years old, and if they grew up in this area, I actually went all the way back to their high school, okay? And we talked to some of their teachers about how they were in high school. All right, I went to some of the colleges if they went to colleges around here. Do you remember so-and-so? Oh, yeah, I remember them. I'd also do this. Okay, say I remember this. I had this 22-year-old, and he grew up in the area here, and I went over to the high school, and I talked to the teacher, and I was like, yeah, so who did he hang out with in high school? And they gave me like 5 dudes' names, right? So I went and interviewed these 5 dudes, and they were like, oh, yeah, we used to smoke pot all the time back in high school, blah, blah, blah. Okay, good. I'm getting stuff on this person, right? Okay, so then I'd be like, oh, okay, did he have any girlfriends, anything like that? Oh, yeah, he dated so-and-so. Okay, so now I interviewed her. How was so-and-so in high school, blah, blah, blah. Do you know of him? Yeah. What can you tell me about him, right? Did you ever have a problem with drugs, alcohol, blah, blah, blah. I went extensive. I remember I sat down at one house because you also do a home visit. And I went down to this, he is still living with his mom and dad. I sat down with his parents and him, and I got this notebook, and I had probably close to 25 to 30 pages of interviews with people. And I go through all the pages, and his dad goes, is that all on my son? I said, yeah, it is, and I'm not done yet. I'm about halfway through. And he said, oh, wow, I can't believe you have that information on him. So then I'm like, well, yeah. I said, did you know your son used to jump on the railroad tracks and vandalize the carts? And he's like, what? And the kid looks at me, he's like, who told you that? I'm like, how come you didn't tell me that? You know, so I mean, we start getting into different things in background. I mean, it's extensive background, right? And you got to think about this. What sits up right by the airport? Who flies into the airport? The president, the vice president, who works the motorcades. You know what I'm saying? If you're standing right next to the president of the United States or vice president of the United States with a gun, you better make sure that person has a good background, right? Okay, so I mean, we really did the backgrounds good. Watch your social media. That's the first thing we look at. We sit down, run the social media. I'll ask you, come on, sit down next to me, okay? Open up every social media that you have. You're like, because I've already done my check on you, right? So now at that point, you're like, well, I don't feel like it. I'll say, fine, you're not getting hired. Period. That's easy. As far as the background, once you pass a background check at that point, you'll go to a medical exam. As long as you're fit with that and pass that, you're good to go. There's also a physical fitness test that you have to pass. So you have to go through a police academy to become a police officer, okay? Once you graduate the police academy, you got to take a written test and a physical test by MCOLS. Once you pass the written and physical test with MCOLS, okay, at that point they'll make you certifiable. When a police agency hires you, they'll certify you. So if you decide to go to a police academy and get yourself certifiable, once an agency hires you, they'll certify you. If Grand Rapids PD hires you in, sends you to recruit school, after you get down the police academy, after you pass the MCOLS written test as well as a physical test, at that point they will give you your certification after that. As far as it goes, you get hired, you're good to go at that point. Now you go through field training. Field training is extensive. Field training goes into a lot of stuff because now you're sitting next to another police officer and you're usually working 10 to 12 hour shifts. So you're sitting in a cruiser next to that person for 10 to 12 hours, sometimes more a day. Think about how that stinks. Because I remember during FTO, you'd be driving your car and you got somebody critiquing every single thing you do. Well, try to do your first traffic stop. You see a car speeding going the other way. Now you want to turn on it. You turn around and you realize that you screwed up your turn and you hit the curb, go off the curb, go down, and he's like, writing it down, right? Better see improvements on the next one. Okay, that's stressful. I've seen officers literally lose. This one officer lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks with one FTO because he was so stressed out. Okay, but it's stressful. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of things, but they're also teaching you. So you go through phase 1, okay, with that first FTO. Then you go to phase 2 with another FTO for another month. Then you go to phase 3 with another officer for another month. And then you'll have 2 weeks of what we call shadow. And what happens is the first FTO that you went with will now be in normal clothes. And they'll be sitting next to you, and they basically won't interfere with anything that you're doing. They just shadow you around to see if you're doing the right thing, making the right decisions, being tactical, calling others when you need help, and if you don't know something, you know how to find the resources to find something. That's basically what they're doing, and if you pass that, good. Now you're on your own, but you're on probation for that first year. Now, after that probation is done, then at that point, you know, you go on throughout your whole career and you better not mess up because otherwise you'll get fired, right? So that's kind of the steps of law enforcement. As far as dealing with law enforcement and different issues, okay, so you start looking at a lot of things right now. You start looking at that police brutality. And a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, there is a lot of issues right now with use of force. And we're going to talk about the use of force right now because I think it's important. So when we start talking about use of force, what force can an officer use for someone, okay, or against someone? What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video up right now. So I'm going to stop it here. And then I'll do a part 2 so you can rest your legs, stand up, or not rest your legs, but stand up, get some blood going. So we're going to stop it here and we will pick up on part 2, okay, so that you can watch both parts and go from there. All right, everybody, thanks for watching this part, and then be ready to watch part 2.